Hey there, it's Jeremiah. A quick message before the show. Thank you all for listening to the Neoliberal Podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by going to patreon.com/neoliberalproject. Patrons get access to bonus episodes that are patron exclusive, our Sticker of the Month Club, and they get access to our community Slack, where you can hang out with like-minded people and discuss politics, economics, world events, and more. Become a patron today at patreon.com/neoliberalproject, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is nobody. This is an episode with just me. It's a mailbag episode, and we are answering your questions. How can you get your questions featured on the podcast? A couple ways. You can send them to mailbag@neoliberalproject.org. We check that email. We always answer the questions that come in. Or if you don't like sending emails, you can join us on Twitch. Every Tuesday night, generally, on Twitch, you can check out our live streams, and we chat there, and we answer questions there. So join us on Twitch or send us an email. So there's nothing left to do but jump into the first question. So the first question comes from our mailbag. It's from Ryan, who says, Jeremiah, big fan of the show. Thank you for all the thoughtful work. Lately, I've been wondering if the neoliberal community has thought much about the optimal amount of income redistribution to involve in the tax code, and how far are we from that in the US? It seems to me there must be good academic models out there for individual happiness as a function of wealth. How should we redistribute total GDP? I imagine you could put all this together as some sort of aggregate utility function, take a derivative, set it equal to zero. Is there any thinking along those lines at the moment? So that's a really interesting question, Ryan. Thank you for writing that in. This is one of those things where I think, in theory, that sounds like something you could do, right? Theoretically, we could just say, okay, how much do people value money? People value having $10,000 at this much. People value having $20,000 at this much. You know, being a millionaire is this much better than being a half millionaire. You can kind of assign some value to every level of wealth, and then try to figure out, okay, how do we redistribute the wealth such that this is the optimal system, right? In theory, that's something you can do, but I don't think that's something that in practice can be done now or probably ever, because the real world is just too complicated. You know, we've proposed some sort of model that has like two variables. It's got the amount of money you have and how happy you are. And maybe you could even throw in, I don't know, a third variable, a fourth variable. But this kind of like macroeconomic modeling, the amount of silent variables there has got to be in the hundreds in terms of it's not that easy. There's always complicating factors. There's always going to be stuff that like makes this way, way harder than just, well, this person has a higher utility, marginal utility of money, so the next dollar should go to them. It's never just that simple. The real world is really, really complicated. The one thing I would encourage you to read or to think about along these directions is a book called Seeing Like a State by James Scott. Seeing Like a State has a really good set of explanations and examples of why these kind of grand schemes often fall apart. There's a lot of times when governments in the past have said, society's a little bit broken. We know how to fix it. We're going to totally reinvent this entire society. We're going to reinvent the entire way everything is done. And it usually leads to disaster. That's James Scott's message, is that governments are never quite as good at tinkering as they think they are. And often when they try to just bulldoze institutions and bulldoze the way things work without really careful consideration, they end up making it a lot worse. He gives examples of, Soviet agriculture, collectivization, trying to build cities like Brasilia where they're terribly designed because they were designed according to an ideal that didn't turn out to be very ideal. There's a lot of examples, but that's where my mind goes when I think about, like, couldn't we just plug in an equation for, like, what the optimal redistribution scheme is? No, you're never going to be able to get that right. The second order effects, the third order effects are going to dominate there. So, but it is a good question, you know. It's worth thinking about. It means that you're thinking about problems seriously, at least. So, Ryan, thank you so much for the question. The next question comes from Andy. Andy says, hi, new to the podcast, so forgive me if this is a bad question. There's almost never any bad questions, Andy. Have you ever taken a serious look at the APT tax? It's something that got my attention years ago, but has only recently had the benefit of a wiki page and YouTube videos explaining how it works. And he includes a Wikipedia link here. I'd love to hear your thoughts, as I think phasing to this system could have a profound effect on our workplace efficiency. I believe there was an attempt to implement it in Brazil with a much larger rate than envisioned in this paper. He's linked to paper. And with many exceptions, which the original plan does not allow. All right, Andy, so we're going to take a look at this. So for those who aren't aware, an automated payment transaction tax, an APT tax, I'll call it, is a small uniform tax on all economic transactions. I believe this refers to basically every economic transaction, whether you are trading a stock or a bond, or whether banks are doing transactions with each other, like B2B transactions between businesses, between banks. This would be sales. So it's a sales tax and an income tax and a business-to-business tax and a stock purchasing tax. It's everything all at once, is what it appears to be for me when I'm reading this. I was not familiar with it, really, until reading this question. And that's what it appears. If I'm misinterpreting it, I apologize. But it appears to be like you put a small rate on everything. Now, to me, this seems like a really terrible idea. I at least at first glance, I will say that I have not given this a ton of thought because I'm just being introduced to it. But the same small tax on every kind of transaction doesn't seem to me to be the right way to set up your tax system. There are some things that we want to tax more than others. There are, the obvious example would be something like cigarette taxes or something like that, where we have sin taxes, you could call them Pigouvian taxes, and they're meant to discourage something that we think is bad for society, like cigarettes. Rather than banning cigarettes outright, we simply put a tax on them. You could also think about something with negative externalities like carbon emissions. We put an extra tax on carbon emissions. The APT tax is a tax that just says every kind of transaction gets taxed at the same rate. And even beyond that, something like carbon is a really easy example. You obviously want to tax carbon at a high rate, but there's also good reasons why corporate income and personal income maybe they should be treated differently. Maybe the sales tax should be different from the rate that you pay when you sell a stock. Like, the assumption that all of these rates should be equal strikes me as a really, really incorrect assumption. And I'm not sure why it would be desirable for them to all be equal. I guess you could say, well, the system is very simple and it's easy to keep track of if you do it this way. But I don't know. I don't buy that the simplicity is worth that much. Simplicity is good, but there's really great value in being able to have different rates for different types of economic phenomenon, because they might have different effects. One tax might not affect much at all. You can tax it a lot, and the behavior only changes a little bit. One tax might be really, really sensitive. You tax it even a little bit, and people's behavior wildly changes. This is real. This is how economic works. The margins for changing behavior are not the same all the time. So I would have to say that the automated payment transaction tax is not something that I think I would support, at least at the moment. But thank you for the question. The next question comes from Evelyn, who says, thank you for taking my question on the latest Mailbag episode, and you're very welcome, Evelyn. I enjoyed hearing your responses. I'm flattered to have been featured on the podcast. Again, you're very welcome. The question is, neoliberals care a lot about GDP and gross world product. But why? As an almost utilitarian, I don't value GDP in itself, but as a proxy for actual human well-being. People are generally better off the more they consume, but consumption has diminishing marginal returns to the individual. So if we correctly aggregated people's incomes into something that measured true well-being, we'd end up with something different. Furthermore, the more inequality there is in the world, the less that global GDP tracks total human well-being. So I have two questions. Why do governments still aim to raise GDP rather than raising well-being directly? How would public policy be different or similar if it aimed to maximize well-being rather than GDP? So this is a really good question. Let's take a look at why people do target GDP. I think this is for a couple reasons. Firstly, I think you're correct 100% in that what we ultimately care about is not GDP. We care about people living good lives. We care about human flourishing. We care about people's well-being in that utilitarian sense. It's not just a number, it's their actual subjective experience, right? The useful thing about GDP is that in almost every way, it mirrors that. It tracks those things very, very closely. The correlation is really high. When income goes up, just about everything else goes up in a society. You can think about, like, what are some of the other things we would measure if we wanted to talk about human well-being? We might talk about how long people live. We might talk about how healthy they are. You know, are they living long and healthy lives? We might talk about the amount of freedom that they have. Or do they have political freedoms? We might talk about their subjective happiness, you know, their levels of stress day to day. You can look at things like, you know, do people die in childbirth? Do children die before they're 2 years old? Do children grow up with debilitating diseases? Do children get education? Education is something that we usually talk about as, you know, a real good thing that leads to a flourishing society. You can talk about free time. Do people have more free time or less free time? All of these things are correlated with increasing GDP. When GDP goes up, when median incomes go up, people have more free time, they're healthier, they're wealthier, their children don't die as much, their children aren't as sick, their children get more education. Just gender equality is generally better in richer countries than poor countries. Political freedoms are normally better. None of these correlations are 100%, of course, but they're pretty strong correlations nonetheless. So you can understand why it's much easier for a government to just say, let's increase GDP, let's just make ourselves a richer society, rather than let's try to target the 25 other things that people have listed that they want us to care about. You know, if 23 out of those 25 are going to be correlated with GDP, just increase GDP. That's the reason I think that in a practical sense they do this. The second reason that I think it's tough to move away from GDP as a measurement is that it's tough to come up with a replacement. There are countries that have tried to do this. I think famously Bhutan invented something called the Gross National Happiness or Gross Happiness Index or something like that. And they were explicitly using this idea. We want to measure our people's well-being, not just how rich they are. But when you construct that index of happiness, it has issues too. It has methodological issues just like GDP does. There are scholars that have noted the underlying values in these pillars, the things they actually put into the equation to calculate gross national happiness, those things sure seem to be associated with being Buddhist. You know, those values sure seem to be distinctly Buddhist, and it's like they're measuring how Buddhist you are as a country. I'm pretty sure, I haven't looked this up, so if I get it wrong, I get it wrong, but I am something like 90% sure that in the first versions of that calculation, gross national happiness, how much you played the national sport, how many hours a day you played the Bhutanese national sport, was actually included as a variable in the equation, which you can see how that would be kind of ridiculous. One person who likes sports is by default considered happier than another person who doesn't like sports. So that's one of the reasons that I think it's difficult to move away from GDP, is that even if you create some alternative index, that index is also going to have issues. But Evelyn, thank you so much for the question, and appreciate you sending it in. So we're going to switch gears here for just a second, and rather than taking the next questions from the mailbag, we're actually going to take these from our Twitch chat. Again, just in case you don't know, we stream every Tuesday night on Twitch. We do live streams, we talk with chat, we talk about current events, we play games sometimes. It's a lot of fun. But right now, we're actually live streaming this podcast recording, and the Twitch chat has got some questions as well. A lot of these questions are about the recent bombshell news. There was a leaked decision draft from the Supreme Court that indicates they are planning to overturn Roe v. Wade. And that's obviously going to be some of the biggest political news in a long time. It's earthquake level event for American politics. Abortion has always been something that's simmering under the surface. So because this just happened, we've got questions about it that are coming in live, and we're going to take some of those. So the first question comes from our Twitch user, La La Land, who asks, should Democrats push for federal abortion protections? It seems like it would just open the path to a federal abortion ban in 2024. So here's the way I think about this. If I was a Democrat in Congress and a bill came up to vote for codifying abortion as a legal right, that Congress passes a law that says abortion is legal everywhere, I would vote for that bill. And I think introducing that bill is fine. It's not going to pass because of the Senate, unfortunately. The Senate has a 60-vote threshold for this kind of thing. You need to overcome a filibuster from Republicans, and so it will not pass. Therefore, the real question becomes, should Democrats eliminate the filibuster in order to pass abortion protections, in order to codify abortion as legal? There's a lot of people who think the answer to that question is yes. But I'm not sure that I can agree with that. I'm not sure that it would be a good idea to overturn the filibuster, get rid of it. It would be the end of the filibuster forever in any situation. And we're about to enter a period where the GOP is probably going to control the Senate for the next decade or 2 decades. The GOP, as it stands right now, Republicans have an absolutely overwhelming advantage in just the structural makeup of the Senate. There are more red states than there are blue states. We're in a weird situation as a country where there's roughly equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans in the country at any given time. And in fact, usually there's a little bit more on the Democratic side, but Democrats tend to be clustered into very big states, and Republicans have a lot of very small states that they dominate. And so the bias in the Senate is about to become just enormous. You know, I've seen projections from very, very serious people. David Shore, G. Elliott Morris, people who do electoral projections as a living, polling as a living, who are very, very worried about this. And so the idea that we need to get rid of the filibuster forever before, you know, kind of just before Republicans take over the Senate for a decade or more, that seems to me to be a real mistake. I think it would be a huge mistake. The Democrats might not have the Senate in 6 months. And, you know, taking away the filibuster now, right as you're about to lose power, seems to me to be a pretty large strategic blunder. So that's kind of how I think about it, unfortunately. Let's take another question from chat. This one comes from Mr. Kowalski's Woodblock. Do you have any clever ideas how to make the right to abortion a tax or some kind of commerce? I will just have to say straight up, the answer is no here. I don't have any clever ideas here. I know that there are things that in the past have been done like this where some real tricky legal loophole that maybe it's kind of sketchy, maybe it's not, gets used to justify something in like a real roundabout way. I think a good example of this was Obamacare. there was a Supreme Court decision upholding Obamacare where basically there was a question, is the federal government allowed to have this kind of mandate and, punish people if they don't have insurance or something like that? And John Roberts wrote a real weird decision saying, well, it would be illegal if it was a mandate, but it's not really a mandate, it's just a tax on people who don't do it. And therefore, it actually is constitutional. And it was this very twist yourself into a pretzel kind of logic. And I think what Kowalski is asking about is there any hope for people who want abortion rights and reproductive rights to stay the way they are? Is there any hope for one of those kind of things? My instinct says no, there's not. That's straight up. I think the answer is just no. I will say I'm not a lawyer. I have no legal training. Maybe somebody smarter than me can come up with a better loophole than I would be able to come up with. But as far as I know, the answer is no. Our next question comes from the chat user Mookie of the Year, who asks, will Roe v. Wade affect the midterm? Short and to the point. I think the answer is pretty obviously yes. The real question is not will it affect the midterm. The real question is how much will it affect the midterm. I think Democrats politically would be extremely wise to use this issue as a way to drive turnout, as a real turnout supercharger. I think that Democratic voters and liberal and progressive voters who may previously have not had a ton of enthusiasm going into 2022, this is the standard story, right? The party that's out of power has more enthusiasm in midterm elections. That's almost always how it ends up going. But now you want to talk about enthusiasm. I think you might see a real surge. So it's hard to say. We haven't seen any polling on this yet. We don't have any hard evidence. But my expectation is that the Democrats' chance to hold on to the House or to hold on to the Senate has increased because of this. How much it's increased is very hard to say. But that's what I'm thinking. Our next chat question comes from Milton Middleson. There's been a lot of hand-wringing and tut-tutting about the fact that a draft opinion was leaked. Do you think that this leak is something we ought to care about, or is this just performative outrage? So that's an excellent question, Milton. Thank you for sending it in. I think that it's been an interesting thing to watch people care about, because I actually do think this is a big deal. I think the leak itself is a big deal. This is not to say that the decision is not a big deal, because obviously the decision is a big deal. The decision is the main story. But the leak is a really important story as well. And I think, there have been some progressive voices who have said things like, oh, people are freaking out about the leak. Oh, what does the leak mean? You idiots, you dummies. How, the real story is that the Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. How could you possibly even care that there was a leak? But I think that's wrong. You can care about more than one thing at a time. And the leak, I think, is a big deal. And I'll tell you why. We live in a hyper-polarized society right now, politically. Our politics are really poisonous. They're polarized. They're awful. We do not live in a time when there's any sort of congeniality or ability to really work with each other. Joe Biden has been able to get a couple bipartisan bills passed, but that sort of thing is becoming less and less common. It's becoming more and more just open partisan warfare. You see this most in Congress. But it's coming for everything. There have been other institutions that have been somewhat able to avoid partisan warfare. The Federal Reserve is a good example. The Fed has not really become politicized. Maybe some people want it to, but they've done a really good job resisting. Both Republicans and Democrats have basically just put competent people in charge. The Fed just works off of expert opinion, not political at all. Thank God. Thank God for the Fed. The Supreme Court used to be considered that way. The traditional story about the Supreme Court has always been that they are above politics. There might be justices who have this type of philosophy or that type of philosophy, but it's not Republicans versus Democrats on the Supreme Court. They're above the fray. This is the traditional story that you tell. And that story has been getting worse and worse. over the last few years. It's been eroding. The justices now vote in a kind of partisan manner more than they used to. That kind of liberal camp versus conservative camp dynamic has been increasing over time. And there've already been body blows to this. Body blows like Mitch McConnell refusing to put a Democratic nominee up for consideration in the Senate. Like Brett Kavanaugh's nomination, where he was accused of a very serious incident of sexual assault. And there's no hard evidence. There was no hard proof. And so they just approved him anyway. A Republican Congress did. And so trust in the Supreme Court has already been fraying. The geniality has already been decaying. And this is going to throw another bombshell into that. The justices, at least usually, still trust each other, is my understanding. The justices have a great deal of respect for each other, even when they disagree, and they still try to keep it reasonable. But this kind of thing, knowing that your internal documents could have been leaked by another member of the court, or by a staffer or something like that who disagrees with you, that is going to be seen as like an unforgivable breach. They are going to start distrusting each other. They're going to start becoming open partisans. And the Supreme Court is already political. The story that they've always told about themselves, that they are above politics, that's not true. But what I'll say is that they are political in a different way than Congress is political. And it's better. Have you seen our Congress? The Supreme Court is a more functional group than Congress. And I worry that this leak is going to lead them to just becoming like Congress. That Supreme Court justices are going to become just like bickering members of Congress who hate each other. And I think that's really bad for our democracy if that's the case. So that's how I think about the leak. I actually do think the leak is a pretty big deal. And I'm worried that polarization is now swallowing all of our institutions, even the ones that held out. The Supreme Court held out on polarization much longer than Congress did, but I think polarization has come for them, and that they're just going to be like Republican justices versus Democrat justices now. We've got one more question on Roe v. Wade from our Twitch chat before we get back to our regular emailed mailbox questions. And this one comes from Texas Hokies. And Texas Hokies asks, with gay marriage possibly next on the chopping block, should Democrats try to push for a marriage civil rights amendment? I think this would be a good idea. I'm going to change the phrasing, Texas Hokies, of what you said. I'm going to say that they should, not an amendment, as in like a constitutional amendment, but I'm just going to say that they should pass a federal law, legislation, that says that gay marriage is a civil right, and gay marriage is legal everywhere. Number one, because I think this is a political fight they can win. You know, abortion is fairly closely divided in this country. It depends on how you want to phrase what you're doing, but abortion is an issue where it hasn't changed a ton over time. It's gotten just a teeny little bit more towards pro-choice, but it's a small movement. Really, what you would say is over like 40 years, not much has changed. What you've got with abortion is about a third of people who think abortion should almost always be legal. Basically, all abortion legal, or something very similar to that. You've got a third of people who would like some amount of legal abortions, whether that's just the first 12 weeks or just the first 16 weeks or something like that. And then after that, lots of restrictions are fine. That's probably about a third of the country. And then you've got about a third of the country who basically want there to be no abortions. Maybe only they would say an exception if the life of the mother, or sometimes rape and incest. But like basically other than that, all abortion's banned. And so you've got a very closely divided country. And then the direction doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It's going to keep being closely divided. It's best we can see. Gay marriage is a different story. Gay marriage is overwhelmingly popular at this point, and it keeps getting more popular every year. You know, even though we passed it in 2014, that line continues to trend up in terms of approved, disapproved gay marriage. This is the kind of fight that I think would be good if If you could make the 2022 midterms about should gay marriage be legal nationwide, then Democrats win. The problem is, can you actually make that the thing? Probably not. People aren't going to be distracted that easily because the Supreme Court has already said gay marriage is legal, and until they reverse it, it's just not going to be considered a big issue. With that said, I would fully support going ahead and making legislation. Don't trust the court. Don't trust the Supreme Court to keep it that way. Go ahead and push the legislation. Make it a campaign issue as best you can. And why not? It would be a good thing to do. Maybe that would also get filibustered in the Senate, but maybe it wouldn't. I wouldn't be surprised if the Republican Party decided not to filibuster it. I wouldn't be surprised if they decided not to filibuster it. Because I'm just not sure. Then it becomes a fight, is the thing. If it becomes a fight and it allows the Democrats to do sit-ins in the Senate, in support of gay marriage, and they can dominate a couple news cycles talking about how Mitch McConnell hates gay people. And the thing is, the Republicans don't want that to be the story on the news. Republicans know that their position on gay marriage is wildly unpopular and becoming more unpopular over time. And so I don't think they want it to be the fight. Maybe they would end up filibustering in the Senate, but even that could work to Democrats' advantage. So thank you for the question. The next submission comes from our email, mailbag@neoliberalproject.org, and it comes from James. James doesn't actually ask a question. I would normally say our next question comes from there, but James just has an opinion. And we're going to react to his opinion, I guess. We're going to treat it as if it was a question. This is mail that we got in the aftermath of our reaction to the January 6th uprising. We did a 1-year retrospective of that a few months back. And James says, "Thank you for the reminder of how serious this attack was on our democracy. Truly, the GOP has lost its way." He says, "You referred to polarization and illiberalism on the left so as not to create a false equivalence, but your solutions fall flat. Shaming the Republican base will not work, as I'm sure you know. As long as the progressive woke cancel culture remains prominent, normal, otherwise reasonable Republican voters will tolerate Republican excesses. Trump was not created in a vacuum. Just as you can't fathom how GOP voters can believe these lies, many on the left are blind to their own excesses and culpability." So, thank you for the submission, James. There wasn't really a question in there, but we can react to that statement. Is the woke left partially to blame for what's going on with Republican attacks on democracy? I gotta say, I'm a little skeptical of that. I think there's truth on this on the margin. That yes, if Democrats are really, really just incredibly unreasonable about ridiculous stuff, like I think about like the San Francisco school stuff, where they didn't open the schools for multiple years and they totally capitulated to the teachers' unions, and they totally ignored that this could be bad for the children, and the school board was basically a bunch of ideological leftists, and rather than open the schools, they spent most of their meeting time debating whether or not to like rename schools, and not even like the racist, like we named a school after Dianne Feinstein. Do we have to get rid of that now? When things like that happen, yes. And if that becomes very prominent, if that's what's in the news, it is going to drive people to Republicans, because it's ridiculous stuff. So that it's true, obviously. If Democrats are well known for doing ridiculous, crazy things, then people will go to Republicans. But I don't think that is what created Donald Trump, for instance. I don't think that that's what led to the insurrection. Nobody was complaining about, critical race theory in 2015 and 2016 when Donald Trump was rising through the ranks. Wokeism wasn't even really a term that people used back then. Maybe similar concepts were in play, but really it wasn't about that. I don't know. I don't buy the story that that's what created it in the first place. Now that we're here in this spot where the Republican Party wants to overthrow democracy, we do have to worry about Democrats being popular, because if they're not popular, they could lose, and if they lose, Republicans might end democracy. That's a weird series of sentences to say together, but maybe, I don't know. So that's my response to that. I do think it's an issue. Democrats have to try not to do ridiculous stuff, but I don't think it's what caused this issue in the first place. Our next mailbag question comes from Adrian. Adrian asks, is there any future for neoliberalism in East and Southeast Asia? That's a great question, Adrian, and I am happy to report that I think the answer is yes. I don't have a crystal ball, I don't know the future, but I believe that there is a potentially strong future for neoliberalism in East Asia, Southeast Asia. I'll point to a couple examples. Number one, I have to give a shout out to our Taiwan chapter. Our Taiwan chapter, with its lead Angelica Wong, is absolutely fantastic. We love the work they do there. The Taiwanese neoliberals are great. They're big advocates for nuclear energy, which is a big issue in Taiwan. It's one of their big primary energy sources, and they're fighting, the Taipei neoliberals are fighting to make sure that it stays that way, that there's no anti-nuclear movement that takes root in Taiwan. So I love what's happening there. Taiwan, I think, has a lot of potentially neoliberal characteristics. Taiwan is one of the most pro-LGBT countries in East Asia. They have the biggest pride parades. They have the highest approval of LGBT peoples, I think. I think they're one of the only East Asian countries, maybe the only. I'm not sure if they're the only or one of the only, but they're one of the only East Asian countries that has legal gay marriage. So I think Taiwan is very neoliberal, and I'm excited for the future there. I also think there's progress in some places like Japan, where, look, Japan in a lot of ways is not very neoliberal. They're very nationalistic sometimes. They're not historically very unfriendly to immigration. But I can see things kind of moving in the right direction. I should be clear, they are not friendly to immigration still, but they're getting just slightly friendlier. They're starting to realize, like, the demographic problems they have are pretty serious, and that immigrants would really, really help. Immigrants are really helpful for demographic problems, like Japan has, where their average age is like 80 years old or something ridiculous like that, you know? And so they're not taking in as many immigrants as other countries as they should, but the trend is upwards, and that's very encouraging to me. And just more generally, you know, there's a strong club of Asian democracies, and they're not perfect democracies. They haven't been democracies for hundreds of years, but they are reasonably solid democracies. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. I think these countries have bright futures. And so I think liberal democracy and neoliberalism have potentially bright futures there. I'm excited for the future of that region. This question comes from the user BD1, and they ask, how do you and the other people involved in the neoliberal project and PPI feel about jokes that call you the deep state? Well, this is a really easy question to answer. This is a really easy question to answer because I think they're hilarious. I encourage them. I make the jokes myself sometimes. It's always been part of us since our very first internet communities. People were always joking about how we were part of the neoliberal deep state and we were part of the Soros collective. You know, I don't know if the young children will even remember this, but there was a big controversial group called Correct the Record back in 2016. They were kind of aligned with Hillary Clinton. And when Hillary Clinton was attacked, in their view, unfairly, maybe in somebody else's view it was fair, but, you know, whatever. When Hillary Clinton was attacked, Correct the Record would go out with ads and counterattacks trying to correct the record. And of course, the Bernie Sanders people hated them. They just despised them. It was considered the demon group. Like, Correct the Record had the same internet cachet as, like, Al-Qaeda. Like, it was bad. And so we would make jokes about us being Correct the Record, that we were paid shills for Correct the Record. And we'd be like, has your check come in yet, you know, from Correct the Record? So I think those jokes are fantastic. I think they're great. It's part of our cultural identity as neoliberals to make jokes about being secret globalist shills, you know. So I'm all in favor, 100%. Our final mailbag question from our inbox comes from Dieter. And Dieter has two questions that are actually very different from each other. The first one, New Mexico recently legalized weed, and I've noticed a huge amount of dispensaries pop up all over Albuquerque. Do dispensaries have the same failure rate as bars, or is it a completely different economic thing? I'll answer this one very quickly and just say I have no idea. Absolutely no idea. And honestly, we probably don't have enough evidence. You know, this has only been a phenomenon, legal marijuana shops, for like a couple years in the United States. So we don't have a lot of evidence, I don't think, on what's going on there. So, sorry, I'm going to push that out of the way real quickly, Dieter, and get to your second question, which I think is a little more interesting, and which I have a better ability to respond to. The second question says, neoliberals and the neoliberal subreddit are generally about incremental change within a system. So why are there so many Georgists? And Georgist refers to people who advocate for a land value tax, who want to tax the value of land, the unimproved value of land, not the value of the structures, of the buildings, but just the value of the land itself. The Georgist ideology, he says, seems to be antithetical to this. It is a huge, disruptive mess that maybe would work. I think that is actually a really fascinating question, because I think you're right. I think this is two aspects of the neoliberal community that are honestly kind of in contradiction to each other. Neoliberals very much do tend to be incrementalists. They say, we don't have to have a revolution. We don't have to upend society and have, throw everything out the door. We can just make things a little bit better at a time and keep improving, and the world will get better that way. That is a very neoliberal ethos. It doesn't mean we don't want big changes sometimes, but it does mean that, we tend towards incrementalism. And yet we also tend towards having a lot of people who like the land value tax. A lot of people are convinced by arguments about how efficient it would be. It's an economically efficient tax in a lot of ways. They think it would have great distributional outcomes. There's a lot of reasons people like it. The economics behind it are potentially very promising. But it would be, moving to a land value tax dominated system would definitely be not an incremental move. It would be a pretty large change. And especially if you did it in the way that like the hardcore Georgists do. The hardcore land value tax people. Who are like, it's practically all you need. Tax the land. It maybe if you have to, tax carbon. Don't tax anything else. These are kind of the extremists, but that's like uprooting the entire system. And so I don't know why it happens precisely, but I think you found an interesting contradiction that we should try to work out. The answer I would give, why does this happen, is number one, people tend to like things that economists like. If academic economists like some wonky solution to a problem, our community is probably going to get behind it. We tend to follow the economic expert advice in a lot of instances. And so that's one of the reasons people like land value tax. The other thing I would say is maybe there's some sort of fusion you can do here, where you can try to very incrementally introduce a land value tax. I'm sure there's probably a way to do that. You'd have to get into the real technocratic details of how it would be constructed and blah, 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 blah. But there's probably a way. So that's how I think about that. But thank you very much for the question, Dieter. Our final question comes to us once more from the Twitch chat. And again, if you'd like to join us on Twitch, you can do so, twitch.com/neoliberalproject. This question comes from the user 1396 Spurs, who just asks, what are you excited about in the near-term future? It can be politics, personal, sports, anything. I really appreciate that question because it lets us end on a positive note. There's a lot to be anxious about in the modern world. Roe v. Wade is probably going to be overturned in the next few months. It'll be a lot harder for a lot of women to exercise their bodily autonomy and to exercise their reproductive rights. And, I think it's going to cause a pretty great deal of suffering that this has happened. There's things you can be concerned about with the Republican Party. The Republican Party might take power again in 2022, at least congressionally, and might try to do a bunch of really awful stuff. And, if they get power again, they seem to have very little respect for democracy itself. So there's a lot of things, I'm touching on these very briefly, but there's a lot of things to be discouraged about. But I do think there are also things to be excited about. I think that one of the things I'm excited about in the very immediate future, if you know me at all, you know that I love Carly Rae Jepsen. This is a big thing with me. Some people think it's a joke. I assure you it is not a joke. It is serious. And Carly Rae Jepsen has an album coming out tomorrow, I think. Either tomorrow or Friday. Carly Rae Jepsen drops her new album. By the time this episode of the podcast is out, it will probably be out while you're listening to it. It's called Western Wind. I'm very excited about that. You might say it's a small thing. I disagree. It's one of the most important things. She's the best. In more serious kind of political stuff, one of the things I am very optimistic about and very excited about is seeing if we can break out of this kind of stagnation that society has been in for a while. People coined this term, the Great Stagnation. And what it meant was that, for a while, for several decades now, it really seems like economic growth has not been as fast as it used to be. People would say, from 1900 to 1940, we grew at very high rates. And now we're just growing at like 1.5% per year, 2% per year. And growth is just not as good as it used to be. It used to be a lot better. And so I think that's been true, but I think there are some signs that we might be able to break out of that. There have finally been some technological indicators that new technologies are really driving growth forward. I was really encouraged when we had that recession in the pandemic, but our recovery from that recession was really, really strong. And we actually are even above baseline, above what we would have been if growth had continued the same. So I'm just optimistic about the potential for new technologies to be transformative in the future and for our economic growth to kind of get turbocharged again. So I think that will be the episode, everyone. I think that will wrap up our podcast. As always, if you have questions for the Neoliberal Podcast, send them to mailbag@neoliberalproject.org, and you can get your questions answered on the podcast. If you like a more interactive live format, come hang out with us on Twitch, twitch.com/neoliberalproject, where we are streaming every week, and we chat with users and answer your questions live there. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.